Thank you very much. I'm actually very disciplined about when I attend these conferences. I carefully do write my remarks in advance. Then I do have a habit of, while I'm flying over on the airplane, of rewriting everything. And then I come here and listen to everyone talking and then go back to my room and rewrite everything again. And by the time I hit here, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to say. In the 1970s, when I began my first involvement in research on terrorism, guerrilla war, insurgency, irregular warfare, or what we now call asymmetric warfare, were all lumped under the generic label COTW, conflict other than war. That was the term. All of these were conflict other than war. The term war was reserved for past and anticipated large-scale conventional military contests between regular military forces, like World War II or some hypothetical future war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Or even in Israel, people talk about the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, the Gaza operation. As a former soldier, I can tell you, when you're in it, it's really hard to know the difference, whether you are in a war or a conflict other than war. They all tend to look alike. The acronym COTW is now obsolete. Irregular or asymmetric warfare is no longer considered a distraction from the wars that really count, but rather a mode of conflict that has now become the main preoccupation of military establishments, especially in the United States and Israel, as much as generals might prefer it not to be. This is one of the major developments we've seen over the last 40 years. And this afternoon, what I thought I'd like to do is try to identify some of the broad trends in terrorism and counterterrorism and put those within the context of some of the even broader trends in warfare itself. We begin with good news. Warfare is not in danger of extinction, but warfare is declining. That is, there are fewer wars in progress today than at any given moment today than there were in our history in the late 20th century or the middle of the 20th century. And the number of total deaths worldwide as a consequence of war is declining. So that's more good news. And we see this even in our own casualty figures. The United States, which was among the more fortunate participants in World War II, lost 250,000 men killed in combat. My war in Vietnam, we lost 58,000. In Iraq, we lost approximately 5,000. In Afghanistan, approximately 1,500. In Israel, in the first 4 wars between 1948 and 1973, there were approximately 10,000 Israelis killed in action. In the 40 years since 1974, fewer than 1,000. I don't mean to sound callous about any single death, of course, but again, this is positive news. As armed conflict has declined, however, terrorism has ascended. It has ascended from a set of tactics, which it was in the early 1970s, to a sophisticated strategy. The perpetrators have evolved from a handful of urban terrorist gangs to global terrorist enterprises. We've seen, to use Boaz's term, the emergence of hybrid terrorist states or quasi-states like Hezbollah, Hamas, the Islamic State. We've seen increasingly ambitious terrorist operations as military establishments have attempted to reduce the number of casualties in warfare, including reducing the number of collateral casualties. Terrorists have gone in the other direction and have increasingly sought to carry out large-scale, indiscriminate violence. And sometimes the public misses that while we are trying to reduce casualties, they are trying to maximize casualties. While we are trying to make very precise, difficult distinctions, even in combat, they are going in the opposite direction and attempting to apply indiscriminate violence. And indeed, the worst terrorist incidents in the 1970s, in terms of fatalities, were measured in the tens. This ascended to the hundreds in the 1980s. On 9/11, it ascended into the thousands. Now, this was an order of magnitude increase almost every 10 years, and it led some analysts to extrapolate that future terrorist incidents might involve tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of casualties. Those would only be possible if terrorists use weapons of mass destruction, and thus far, and this is more good news, with the exception of some smaller scale chemical and biological attacks, terrorists have not entered the domain of weapons of mass destruction. On the counterterrorism side, we have moved from efforts to outlaw terrorist tactics and instead to waging war on terrorist groups. We still prosecute individual terrorists, but now we also are determined to destroy terrorist groups. We've moved from creating a corpus of international conventions, which we did in the 70s, 80s, and 90s with some success, to the employment of military force. Israel was very quick to see terrorism as a form of armed conflict, as simply a continuation in another form of the military threats that had threatened the nation of Israel since its very creation. The United States came to the use of military force more slowly, incrementally. Military force was first used in an attempt to rescue hostages. Then military force was used to assist in the apprehension of terrorists abroad. Then military force was used in retaliation against state sponsors, and later in retaliation against terrorist groups, but these were one-off operations. And then we moved after 9/11 to a continuing national campaign to destroy a terrorist organization. And now we've gone further, and we have the use of lethal force against terrorist leaders outside of immediate conflict zones. We will hear tomorrow from President Obama about, and most likely, a multilateral campaign against the Islamic State. So that is moving in a different direction. However, many people in the world would reject the use of military force against terrorism. And this is consistent with a growing sentiment against the use of military force in general. And that by itself is not a bad thing, but it has consequences. Modern nations are increasingly reluctant to go to war. It's not simply the result of traditional pacifism. It is rather more the consequence of calculations of individual and collective costs. war is impractical. While intelligence and the development of precision-guided weapons has enabled us to reduce casualties and to reduce collateral casualties, we cannot do so fast enough because we have public world opinion that demands zero casualties, and that is unachievable. Conscription in the nations of the world is increasingly rare. Standing armies, along with defense budgets, are shrinking. It is increasingly difficult to mobilize or sustain military contests not perceived as existential threats. And despite the concerns in Western Europe and the United States about terrorism, about returning foreign fighters, terrorism is not viewed as an existential threat. Yes, for the Yazidis, as we saw tragically portrayed this morning, but not for us. It's still that thing over there. These sentiments have led to increasing constraints expressed in the form of tighter rules of engagements, even the introduction of what I would regard as curious concepts, such as the concept of fairness in warfare. Now, that's not the same as the concept of proportionality, which has some standing in warfare, but fairness, and that is weapons that can be used by operators who are not exposed to equal risk of the targets should be outlawed. These are inherently unfair weapons. So drones should be outlawed as a method of war because the operator of the drone is not exposed to danger. We also see the application of criminal justice and the conduct of war, traditionally two separate domains, are increasingly being blurred. Some seek to bring wartime rules into the civilian sector. They argue that we are at war with terrorists abroad, therefore terrorists arrested on our own territory, even those suspected of terrorism, should be treated as enemy combatants and detained without due process. At the same time, others want to bring law enforcement rules onto the battlefield and argue that war requires a criminal predicate, that the use of military force must include some component of criminal justice procedures, judicial warrants, identification of specific suspects, efforts to apprehend rather than kill. These circumstances and constraints prevent victory in its classic military sense. Instead of victory, we see, instead of unconditional surrender, we see imposed ceasefires. And the ceasefires really, in a sense, are aimed at buying time until the next eruption of open warfare. And that's the case with Gaza. The achievement was hopefully a period of longer peace until the next outbreak in Gaza. We purchase peace by the slice. Now, who won? That is a matter of dispute, and indeed may ultimately be settled in the portrayal of the negotiations. With increasing constraints on the applications of military force, warfare is increasingly about the manipulation of perceptions. And that may be the most important thing I think I'm saying today. Warfare is increasingly about the manipulation of perceptions. Now, this is something our terrorist adversaries may understand more readily than we do. An Al-Qaeda strategist said once that communications was 50% of the struggle. Another one said it was 90% of the struggle. We use communications, that is public diplomacy, psychological operations, to explain, to support, to justify, to defend military operations. Terrorists use violence to support communications, exactly the opposite. We do shock and awe with air power, with armored vehicles. They do shock and awe with YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And this is a fundamental difference. We simply do not have, despite constantly pointing this out, we don't have the structures for waging political warfare, psychological operations that are anywhere near as developed in terms of doctrine and capabilities as we do for the application of kinetic force. But this is not new territory for us. I mean, terrorists would understand this statement very perfectly. We tended to lose sight of it. Choose only objectives that accentuate the political aspect of our struggle. That is, what you do militarily has utility if it accentuates the political objectives. Again, choose only objectives that accentuate the political aspect of our struggle. Where does that quote come from? It comes from the Haganah Code written in 1946. We understood it then, and we have lost sight of that now. Let me end with a comment that really is provoked by a comment made by an earlier speaker. You know, these meetings help us. An earlier speaker quoted Sun Tzu and the necessity of knowing the enemy and knowing ourselves. And these meetings, for which I'm so grateful to be invited to speak to you again, help us to know the enemy and to know ourselves. But, you know, Sun Tzu did not write in precise language. He wrote in this sort of cryptic, somewhat opaque elliptical phrases that are subject to interpretation. That may in part explain the continuing fascination with these, because they can be adapted to current circumstances. But in the original, knowing ourselves was in the context of more than knowledge. Knowing ourselves was about strength and weaknesses and spirit, and it was about knowing ourselves meant also preserving our spirit. And in that sense, these meetings are important because they are not only opportunities to learn more in terms of knowledge, but among the people here from all of the countries, an opportunity to renew and develop our spirit. And with that, we are unconquerable. Thank you very much.